Good afternoon to everyone, or good morning, depending on the time zone. We open this afternoon session of this second day of our seminar from Dialogue to Polylogos, or Polylogos, which is dedicated to explore the issue of dialogue under the light of different disciplines and experiences. Yes, good, thank you. This morning, we had the chance to explore the issue of interreligious dialogue, the meaning of interreligious dialogue with the first session and a case study related to the project of Wings of Unity. This afternoon, we will try to discuss the role of dialogue and religions in the international politics. At international level, and experts agree on this point, we can see a return of religions in the public life. How can we explain this visible resurgence of religion in world politics? Which is the contemporary role of religion in the international scene? Can religions and interreligious dialogue play a positive role in the resolution of conflicts, tension, or even in peace building? These are only some questions that we will try to explore this afternoon. I thank you very much, our speakers, to be here. We are honored to have you here with us. I introduce you before giving you the floor. We have with us Dr. Vinu Aram. She is president of Shanti Ashram, an international center for learning and development and collaboration that support communities in their efforts to move out of poverty and address inequalities. She founded the International Center for Child and Public Health, and she is deeply committed to the Gandhian spirit and promotes and works for many initiatives that focus on community cohesion, active peace building, and interreligious dialogue. We have Professor Russ Pearce. Russ Pearce is Professor of Law at Fordham University School of Law, is Edward and Marilyn Bellet Chair in Legal Ethics, Morality and Religion, is co-director at the Louis Stein Center for Law and Ethics. He teaches professional responsibility, lawyers and justice, housing rights clinic, and is author of several publications, and is engaged in dialogue, interreligious dialogue, and especially with regard to Israel and Palestine, dialogue between Israel and Palestine. We have Valentina Pantano. She graduated in Sciences of Languages, History and Culture of the Mediterranean region and Islamic countries at the L'Orientale University of Naples. She is a researcher in historical, archaeological and historical artistic sciences at the Federico II University of Naples, with a project on dialogue between a Muslim community and the Focolare movement, a Catholic-inspired movement in Algeria. Okay. And Fabio Petito, unfortunately, he cannot be here today with us due to unforeseen commitments. He is a senior professor at Sussex University in International Relations, but we had the chance, the opportunity to record a video that we will share to have his contribution on the topic of dialogue in the Mediterranean region. So thank you to be here. After the contribution of each speaker, there will be space for dialogue and time for dialogue. So I encourage very much participants to note their questions and to raise their hands. I will give you the floor. or to use the function question and answers. Okay, we enter in this session, and I would like to start with Professor Vinu Aram, starting with a question for you. As we said, the role of religions in advancing the common good is back in the public discourse in the international context. However, often religions are referred to as creators of conflicts and tensions, while they can be part, or they are sometimes part of the solution. What is your opinion in this sense, and what is your experience in interreligious dialogue?
Thank you, Chiara, for this question. I think all of us who have logged into this session this afternoon in Europe and evening in India, we're all aware and mindful that we're in the midst of a pandemic that has affected over 200 countries and nearly 400 million people who've tested positive to the coronavirus. But even in the midst of this pandemic, we have found the energy to point fingers at one another, to say you are the source of the problem and I am not the source of the problem. And in that long list of problem triggers, I think religion has come again, whether it is in the discussion of vaccine hesitancy, or it is in the discussion of, who are the gatekeepers to communities, it has come. But the truth is, Chiara, that while this is one aspect that the world presents to itself, and we all know when information is presented as a problem, even more when it is presented as a problem of the other, it is very attractive. But let me say, on this same context, let me give you two examples, Chiara. All of us in every country of the world in 2020 knew that the lockdown, the new word in our vocabulary, lockdown, had come, closing of boundaries. And this lockdown came with a very deep realization, Chiara. That is, when these lockdowns came, when countries closed its boundaries and borders, and when cities limited activity, the relevance of the local community became very important in caring for one another, in helping provide essential services, in finding solutions in local communities. And here, Chiara, I want to present why the truth is far from religion being only a source of problem, and why it's a source of hope, and it's a source of service as well. May I use the word service? In the lockdowns, we are seeing evidence from around the world that religious communities, its people, its communities, its assets, whether hospitals, places of worship, warm kitchens, they were all at the service of their people. So that is one thing, and that is at a very hands-on, if I may use another COVID word that we use a lot now, lockdown is one that has entered our vocabulary, and the other is front lines. And I think in the front lines, we cannot but acknowledge that religious communities have been at the forefront. And if you ask people in religious communities what encouraged them, what inspired them to be on the front lines, it would be their values. It is what they see as an essential way of living their faith. But let me also speak to the wonderful participants of this afternoon seminar about what the world is thinking. So one is what the world is experiencing and what the world is thinking. In September of 2021, I was invited to speak at the World Economic Forum. And what struck me in Davos was the title of the 2022 World Economic Forum. It was Working Together, Restoring Trust. Hear the words again, working together, restoring trust. When is it that we have heard in an economic one of the major global events that discusses business and ways in which the world can economically prosper, this as the center of its theme, working together and restoring trust. This is why I think this course that you have of looking at dialogue and looking at shaping multiple views is so important. I say this in the middle of a pandemic because we know that this COVID-19 pandemic has shown not only is it a health crisis, but within the health crisis and beyond the health crisis, there are multiple crises. The crisis of hunger, the crisis of gender inequality, the crisis of xenophobia, racism, and nationalism. It's not one country, it's continents, and every continent can find these expressions. So Kiara, this too I present to say that one, that always perception is not right. You have to go deeper, and religious communities have provided solutions. And the other is to be mindful of the big picture as to where the global thinking and the discourse is going. And here is where, again, I bring to the attention of the wonderful participants and students of this course that what you're acquiring in this course is actually global preparedness, because global thinking is towards initiating more dialogue, initiating also possibilities of working together. But I want to focus on that building trust, Kiara. And, I think one of the important things where dialogue springs is when you believe that the other is important. I come from the Hindu tradition, and I have been taught that the divine grace is a shared grace. The person in front of me carries the same grace of God and the same divineness. So my being a faithful and somebody who lives my religious experience will not only be to worship the divine as a relationship with the grace, but also to acknowledge the divine in the person in front of me. And trust comes when you share this trust and respect about the other. And therefore, I think that the seeds of dialogue emanates from a very fundamental lesson that religion and faith have given us, and that is to see and to seek, not just to see, but to seek the oneness of humanity, that the other human being is important. Having said this, Kiara, in the 15 minutes that you have given me, I want to look at a few things. As I was preparing, I know Professor Catalano is listening, so I prepared myself a little harder with him, not only being an honorary Indian, but also somebody who knows both worlds, the world of theory when it comes to dialogue, but also the power of lived experiences, where interreligious dialogue has also a very, very important relevance in everyday life. When I look at Western literature on interreligious dialogue, there is a historical timeline that they speak about. And in the contemporary world, they speak about 1893, a moment in global events where religions came together in the Parliament of Religions in Chicago. But if you look, if you step back and look at the whole idea of dialogue as a lived experience, then many parts of our worlds have lived it for centuries, and therefore, I think we have to be mindful of studying both these sources, what is in the form of written texts and archived as expressions and articles. But I think it's also very important to go back to lived experiences where people have benefited and people have been enriched by coexisting and dialoguing with one another. I come from India, and I cannot re-emphasize how dialogue as a lived experience is so important. One simple example, the wonderful pilgrim site of Benares is known worldwide. It's such a holy site for Hindus to go and at least once in a lifetime. A similar pilgrimage site in the south is Rameshwaram, on the banks of the Indian Ocean. And there, for the most important festivals of this historic temple, The first pots of water are brought by the Islamic community in that area. Now, what is that? That's a lived experience of trust, but it's also a very practical expression of mutual respect. So to the students, I think I encourage you to look at both these sources. What is in the written form and what is a lived experience? There might be lots of practical and very inspirational stories to deal on. I know theoretically they speak of multiple ways in which interreligious dialogue is advanced, from critical thinking, theological understanding, looking at issues together. But there are also acknowledged in the four sort of official ways dialogues are done, the idea of partnership building, that you come together to address a common challenge. And again, the modern world has a lot of examples in that. Rights of children, for example. It was the first time that religious communities in the 1990s worked with the United Nations to acknowledge the rights of the child. And to all the students who are part of this course, I want you to know that this is the world's most ratified law, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And religion and faith actors were an important part of it. So partnership building as an outcome of dialogue is also something that I want to reiterate in my presentation today. Of course, like I said in the beginning, the pandemic has shown us not just what I may say, the utilitarian benefits on the front lines of providing resources, human resources, financial resources, experiential resources. But in the midst of the pandemic, we have seen how there is a deep cry, a deep human cry for the values that religion stands up and religions together stand for. So, for example, one of the words that has been used systematically, but also I think across by people, is the word solidarity. And if you study religion and if you look at the early lessons that you had in your family, the word solidarity was explained to us by mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers in many different ways. Solidarity was loving one another. Solidarity was sharing. Solidarity was sacrificing for the other. And I think this is again something that dialogue and interreligious dialogue gives us. And as is the topic of this course, I think it gives us not only an understanding from the other's point of view as to what solidarity means, but it also gives us a multiplicity of viewpoints. We don't look at it in a monochrome, in a black and white fashion, but we look at it in the way that diversity provides a richness of understanding of experiences. Now, one of the things that I want to say in the midst of the pandemic has been the focus also between the relationship, if you may say, between personal faith, individual faith, and dialogue between communities or dialogue between people. And this is something that people ask, is interreligious dialogue merely an intentional encounter between two people or groups of people? Is dialogue more than that? What does it lead to? And I think Gandhiji said it so beautifully. Gandhiji said, the peace between countries, the shared unity between countries must rest on the solid foundation of love between individuals. And this is something that I want to bring to this afternoon's presentation, that when you think of influencing the big picture, how can religions coexist in countries like India, where they've existed for centuries? Or how does Europe look at this new encounter that has come through by migration, through wars, through crisis? How does Europe embrace diversity, and therefore requiring Europe for it as a very essential tool to look at interreligious dialogue as a way of building peaceful societies? I think what Mahatma Gandhi points to in his words is that there is an inseparable, but there is also an interconnected way of looking at how dialogue is done at a community, at a societal setting, but also how it is dependent on the individual's own discovery of what dialogue brings to him or her. Let me give you one practical example, Kiera. I was 20 when I went to my first interreligious youth camp. I was a medical student. I was studying medicine. And so being away for 5 days in India was a long time in a medical school. So I was called by the dean of the medical school to explain why I had taken 5 days to go to an interreligious event. Of course, when my dean saw it was an international interreligious event, a youth camp, he said very good when he saw international. And then when he saw interreligious, he rolled his eyes and he looked at me and he said, Vinu, you must be doing this at 60 when you're retired, not when you're 20, he said. And I, being so young and I know, and being in a system that is so, in some ways, so looking up to elders and people with experience and authority, I was quiet. But you know what happened? And these are to all the students who are listening in 4 or 5 weeks, we had riots in my city. My city is Coimbatore, and there were interreligious riots between the Hindu community and the Muslim community. And my medical college was asked to set up medical clinics in these areas of violence because the city had closed down. And at that time, you know who called me? My dean in the medical school called me and said, Vinu, we have to start clinics there. You're still in your 3rd and 4th year, but can you help us do it? Now, I say this because as a young person, at one level, my seniors did not understand the immediate value of why I was committed to interreligious dialogue. Even while they knew as a family, as an individual, I was inspired to follow Mahatma Gandhi and therefore be a committed member of interreligious dialogue. But when a practical situation came, I think they understood its relevance. And therefore, the next point that I make is while it's very important, and I'm very grateful to Sophia University that they are having this program for you and they allow us to come and interact with you. While it's important to look at the theoretical perspective, look at it as a lived experience, it's also important for us to look and visualize into the application of interreligious dialogue in a very, very interconnected global society today. And here is where I think the next part of my sharing comes in. And that is this individual faith, this deep commitment to becoming closer to the divine grace, to be who we really want to be, in communion with the divine. Will we also unleash for ourselves and for our communities the possibilities of mutual respect and peaceful coexistence? For me, the answer is yes, because I think, again, to quote Mahatma Gandhi, he said, when one person grows spiritually, when one person gives an example that lifts the entire community to a new moral compass, you know that the whole society has progressed. Even if one person fails, the whole society drops a little lower. And for all of us who are part of this afternoon's discussion, we know those examples. We know when Mahatma Gandhi led the freedom movement in India, he was giving an alternative, a non-violent alternative to not only to win freedom, but to ensure the respect of both the oppressor and the one who was seeking freedom. When Martin Luther King said he dreamt of a world where everybody was equal, he was not only addressing the issue of racial injustice, but he was also speaking of a vision of an equal world. And therefore, I think that today, as students who are looking at dialogue as a means of creating and shaping a multiple viewpoint, I think what we also give ourselves an opportunity is to look at the link between individual encounters and experiences and collective encounters that can in fact define the character of an entire society. Again, one of the things that is very close to my heart, and I always like to mention, is that interreligious dialogue often works when there is a shared challenge, when there is a shared aspiration. I gave you the example of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was a historic milestone, but also has made the world, I think, a little bit more safer and more, I think, more supportive for every child. Of the 8 billion people in the world, over 2 billion are children whose lives are being shaped today and tomorrow. Let me give you another example, though, why this formal training and this space to deepen one's understanding on dialogue and interreligious dialogue is very important. You know, the previous pandemic that hit the world was HIV and AIDS. Many of you would have read about HIV and AIDS. I was a young medical student. I had just finished my undergraduate studies and I was training in pediatrics. And then is where I found that science and society and the world of religion had to speak, because we had to speak about stigma. We had to speak about exclusion. We had to speak about healing beyond medicine. And medicine alone and science alone did not have answers. So this pandemic has benefited significantly from the experience of the previous pandemic, where interreligious dialogue was an afterthought. When HIV started affecting continent after continent, it was an afterthought. The UN organizations assigned. In this pandemic, it is not an afterthought. In fact, the World Health Organization, the UN has all taken it. So again, what I want to say is not only is it part of a global thought process, today, religious communities and people who believe in dialogue and dialogue between different sections of society, I think acknowledge that interreligious dialogue cannot just be left to an accidental encounter, but can be actively shaped so that the outcome is trust, the outcome is, you know, a very well, not only curated space, but a space where work to address common aspirations come. Chiara, you please tell me when my time is coming to an end. I have only 2 more things. And here is where I want to speak a little bit also about the importance of leadership and why the leader of the 21st century today requires, amongst many other qualities, the quality to be able to facilitate dialogue. A leader today is not here to give us absolute answers. That's not the idiom of the 21st century. The idiom of the 21st century is to facilitate exchange of opinions, is to facilitate a process of clarification and to facilitate consensus building so that we can act on it together. If a leader requires that as an essential requirement, then where are the classrooms? Where are the classrooms which can teach us dialogue and interreligious dialogue and intercultural dialogue? I want to go back to 2 examples. One is the example of Mahatma Gandhi, and the other is the example of Madam Chiara Lubich. Mahatma Gandhi knew very early in India that India being multi-religious, India being multi-ethnic, if India had to celebrate its political freedom together, and if India had to go on the path of progress, he actually called it, he coined a new word, he called it Sarvodaya, Sarva Udaya. He didn't say freedom alone. He said the progress of everybody, the awakening of everybody. He said religion and religious perspectives have to come together. Simple things that I want to share with this forum today, this forum of wonderful students. He brought in the notion of praying in each other's presence, because he knew as a country, we believed in living our tradition. He brought in the notion of seva, service, as an extension of the participation of religious institutions in public life. So where did they learn interreligious dialogue? By praying side by side. Where did people learn interreligious dialogue? By serving one side by side. So the classrooms need not always be the traditional classrooms that we think about. It can integrate classrooms that were not discovered before and that were not presented before as formal spaces. I also learned a very, very unique way of dialoguing from Madam Chiara Lubich. Madam Chiara Lubich, remember, was a 19-year-old young woman in Europe where she saw devastation and pain and suffering in the middle of war. And Madam Chiara Lubich said, it doesn't matter who the leader is. In that particular situation, leadership has to be built, leadership has to be prevented. Here was a 19-year-old who drew inspiration from the text that gave her great solace and meaning, the Bible, the gospel. And she, along with a community of women, provided what she would call much later the notion of unity, the communion of unity. Now, here is another example of dialogue. Dialogue between people who were destined to take leadership roles. It wasn't the order of the day that women took leadership roles. It wasn't the order of the day that lay people took roles. So here again, to the participants of this course, I want you to re-visualize what interreligious dialogue leads to and what is therefore a requirement for leaders of the 21st century to train themselves, to expose themselves, to learn from the examples that abound. And I think in Kiara's example and in Mahatma Gandhi's example, what you saw was that in a very gentle way, they not only kept the commitment to dialogue moving. Kiara started in the small community, then she expanded, and many young people of that generation came together. And then it is for you to study from the pages of history how Kiara became an ambassador to other traditions as well. Her story and her story of leadership in interreligious dialogue is now studied at textbooks and taught in courses of interreligious dialogue. Similarly of Mahatma Gandhi, of how he brought this forward. And so the final point that I make is I'm not only speaking of interreligious dialogue in a sense that one has to study and one has to practice, but what I'm presenting to you, it is part of the global thinking today because people recognize that pluralism is here to stay, that diversity is for us to proactively engage. What I also share with you is, I think, the most important part, that you cannot leave this to chance. If you want peaceful societies to be shaped, if you want peaceful societies to be inclusive, or as Mahatma Gandhi said, a society where the aspiration is Sarva Udaya, the progress of all, I think then it has to be studied. And this course, I think, is that example of creating a space for learning, not only from lived experiences, but also from the rich resource that is there. I'll point you to some materials and I'll send you the reading list. There are two ways that research is now is allowing for evidence to be gathered. One is like the example of Mahatma Gandhi and Kiara Lubick, individual encounters that change the world. And you see researchers looking at that. They're also looking at how interreligious dialogue provided very constructive solutions to global problems. I spoke of HIV, I speak of COVID. The call for vaccine equity has been tremendous from the world of religions and the work done by religious communities. So remember, research is also getting organized and evidence is there. But as I come from India and come from an oral culture, I want to tell you that what you read alone is not the rich archive of interreligious dialogue. You should also draw on the lived experiences of cultures and work there. And finally, on a personal note for me, I have come to believe that my role as a leader has become more wholesome because of what my faith has given me and what this practical experience in interreligious dialogue has given me. It has given me the ability to bring different sections of societies together. You know, when HIV/AIDS struck India, I was just back from Harvard from my higher studies, and I was on the Government of India's committee that was allocating funds for care of people living with HIV. And I remember that meeting when they said, don't give money to religious communities, even though they make up 10% of the health sector in India, because they will use this money to evangelize. That's the word that they used. And I was so pained, I was so disturbed, because I knew that maybe a small fraction of people evangelize, but 95% of religious communities in India, whether it's Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, or Jain, we're providing the last mile connectivity, the care for the most vulnerable. And I reached out to 4 of the religious leaders of India and came back with a note and said how they were serving the most vulnerable. I think I was around 30 then, but I remember the health secretary telling me, do you really trust the people? And I said, I not only trust the people, I know they will do a good job. And today in India, there is a much better cooperation between the government and the religious community. But there's also another thing, and that's the last thing I want to leave you with. We were inaugurating this HIV/AIDS program, and the head of the HIV program was there, and the bishop of the Chennai diocese was there as well. And this president of the HIV program of India, of government of India, looked at the priests. So we had one day the training program for priests and the bishops, and the next day was for nuns. And he turned around and he looked at them in an animated way and said, how many of you are married? And all the young priests were giggling, and the bishop was a bit, taken aback. And after he asked the question the second time, I whispered into his ears, if they were married, they wouldn't be Catholic priests. And he looked at me and he rolled my eyes and he said, but I know a bishop who's married. And then I had to tell him there are Anglican bishops and they are Catholic bishops. So what I want you to know is also there is a world that requires not only trust, but mutual literacy. And dialogue as a means allows not only the deepening of spirit, but also, I think, the breaking of stereotypes and the celebration of a shared humanity. So I thank you for this time, and I hope you've had a chance to hear from my experience, both what individual encounters have led, but also what practical ways in which we can care and serve for our community comes out of it. I'd like to end, of course, with a wonderful thought from Madam Chiara Lubich this evening. She, when I met her, spoke about the preparation from dialogue. She spoke about it as an emptying of oneself to receive the other. To all of you wonderful students, I want you to be reminded of those wise words. That dialogue doesn't happen only at the level of the head and the intellect. Dialogue happens when your heart and your head and your hand, which is the cognitive side, the humanitarian, the emotional side, and the worldly side, the practical side, is all aligned and all primed in discovering the other and working towards that common aspiration of a peaceful world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vinu Aram, for this passionate speech. You touches several points, just some key words that impressed me. The need to keep together the dimension of the local community and the global perspective, the complex perspective of the world, the importance to keep together life, studies, so the practical aspects of dialogue and the more theoretical understanding of dialogue. And you were underlining the necessity of empty ourselves to receive the other. So which requires also an effort for each one of us. So thank you for your reflection, and I will give the floor to the second speaker that we have today, Professor Russ Pearce. Professor Russ Pearce, I will start with a question also for you. I want to have you here. Okay, good. Perfect. So, Professor Russ Pearce, you have an important experience on dialogue regarding especially Israel and Palestine. Okay, which are, according to your opinion, the main obstacles today and the main challenges that you see today in the effort to promote dialogue and collaboration? And which is your experience regarding this point in New York and at Fordham, especially?
Oh, thank you, Chiara. Thanks to you and Roberto for inviting me. Ciao to all. Thanks to Dr. Ram, I will be echoing, I think, some of your themes, though in a different context. So I'll take your invite to start with Fordham. You had also asked me to address the Israeli-Palestinian situation and dialogue. So I want to thank you for giving me such an easy topic to cover in 15 minutes. So here you go. For me, just to give the context of my own connection to dialogue, especially for a conference which is talking about dialogue, polylogos, and identity, I want to be transparent about my own identity as a Jewish American, as a white man. In the United States, I'm part of a religious minority of 3%. I will talk a bit about Israel and Palestine. I'm not Israeli, I'm not Palestinian. I have lived in Israel. My children have gone to school in Israel. I've taught law school in Israel. I worked for 7 years with Justice Ministry. As a Jew, I believe that all people are created equally in God's image. I think that's a commitment that we all share. And for me, that means that I am fully committed to equal rights and equal sovereignty for Palestinians. In the 1980s, for example, I co-founded American Friends of the Israeli Civil Rights and Peace Movement. Now, to talk a little bit about Fordham, I teach at Fordham Law School. We have a focolare office at Fordham Law School, headed by my colleague, Andy Moraes, who's a folklorina and who is attending this program. And I will talk about Andy a little bit more as we go forward. We have ongoing dialogue at Fordham among our group. It's mostly Catholic and Jewish, but with the student participation, we have a significant number of Muslim students, and we try to bring in students from as many religious perspectives or no religious perspective as we can. As I move towards Israeli-Palestinian dialogue, I want to use a framework that our colleague Rabbi Tzvi Blanchard has suggested about looking at dialogue as having two levels. Level one being learning about the other and treating the other with respect. And then level two, I would say it's transformative. What Kiara Lubick and the Focolare would teach about how seeing God in the other helps you more deeply experience God in yourself. And that's transformative, what I would call transformative dialogue. Now, my first experience with this sort of transformative multi-faith dialogue was with the Focolare. I grew up, as I noted, as a religious minority in the US. Most of my peers, most of my friends were Christian, but because my family immigrated to the United States to escape persecution by Christians, I was afraid of Christianity. And what transformed me to the point where I can feel the beauty in Christianity is transformative dialogue. Now, dialogue with Israel and Palestine. Let me just quickly mention some of the challenges, and then I'm going to focus on two particular groups. So the first is the reality is segregation. You don't have an opportunity, for the most part, for level one dialogue. There's very little human contact, and that is true even within the 67 borders of Israel, where 20% of the citizens are Palestinian. I mean, even within the 67 borders, until students go to college, and then even then, in many colleges, this sort of segregation of living, separation of living persists. 2 generations of war and violence. Almost everyone, Palestinians and Jews, almost everyone has had someone they love die or has had their home destroyed. And then the third factor, and I'm going to try to get back to this in the end, maybe in a hope aspect, but as Dr. Aram was talking a bit about, religious people can incite hatred and violence. So the numbers of religious people who incite hatred and violence in Palestine and in Israel are much, much larger than the number of religious people or religious leaders who are working on peace. And that's a tremendous barrier to transformative dialogue. Here are two groups that I want to point out that demonstrate the transformative potential of dialogue, however. And I would say what they do is they turn the barriers of war, violence, and segregation into bridges. And a common thread throughout also is love that begins the dialogue and love that emerges from the dialogue. And as Dr. Aram said, quoting Kiara Lubick, there is an experience in these dialogues of people who are willing to empty themselves to the other, who are willing to make themselves vulnerable, to take what I would say, take risks for God. So the first group, Combatants for Peace, it's fighters, Israeli and Palestinian fighters who have dedicated themselves to peace. How was it begun? Well, there were a group of Palestinian fighters, and I'm using the term fighters. They were people who used violence to resist Israeli oppression. They are people who the Israeli and the Western press would label as terrorists, initiated this group. Why? In Israeli prisons, some of them had created what they call the University of Revolution, where they studied Gandhi and Mandela, where they learned about the Holocaust, where they had experiences with each other that taught them to tap into love they had, in my way of describing it, in themselves, even for people who were part of their oppression. And sometimes it was personal. There's a woman who was a failed suicide bomber tells the story of what transformed her, that the brother of one of her prison guards was killed in a suicide bombing. And the prisoner expected that she was going to, very understandably, experience hatred from the guard who had lost her brother. And instead, the guard responded to the prisoner with love. And this opened the prisoner up. It began her journey to sort of rethink what her role should be. So this group of Palestinian fighters who on their own had connected with love in themselves, read about a statement of Israeli reserve soldiers saying they would refuse to be part of the oppression of Palestinians. And they just wrote the soldiers. Then by soldiers, I mean not fully active in Israel. Most Jews are, certainly Jewish men, are in their reserves, even after they have finished their mandatory service. So these were reserve soldiers. And this group of Palestinians wrote them and invited them to the occupied territory to meet. The Israelis accepted the invitation. They too had to make themselves vulnerable and take a risk. They feared that they could be kidnapped or killed. They didn't know who they would be meeting. They just knew they got this invitation. They parked their cars. They're told by Palestinians, they meant, get out of your cars, get into these other cars being driven by the Palestinians you don't know. And they drove to a meeting place. And they got to the meeting place and they began to tell their stories. And that was the beginning of their dialogue. I mean, was this a group that said, okay, we're a dialogue group? No. These are human beings who are reaching out to each other, opening themselves up. And it was the beginning. And today, Combatants for Peace is a movement. It is former combatants joining in shared nonviolent struggle to end the oppression of Palestinians. One of the events that they do that's the most prominent, if anyone is interested, is they do a joint Memorial Day. So in Israel, Memorial Day it's a major event. I can only compare it to the United States, where Memorial Day is significant generally only to the small number of families who have lost. But in Israel, there will be a siren, all the Jews will stop, all the cars will stop on the highway, and people will get out of their car, and there'll be a few moments. What Combatants for Peace have created is a new Memorial Day, a joint Memorial Day for Palestinians and Israelis that's done equally. And I have to say, now in the days of Zoom, I think I attended the last one. There may have been more than 100,000 people internationally who joined with the ceremony. The other group, and I see I'm running low on time, so I'm going to try to, I'll shorten some of this, is called Parent Circle Families Forum. And again, it builds on the tragedy of the region. My colleague, Andy Moraes, who I mentioned, co-teaches a course that focuses in significant part on Parent Circle. There's a famous novel by Com McCann called The Paragon, about two fathers in this group. So how do you become a member of this group? You become a member of this group by having one of your family members killed by the other side. And in part, this is, again, it's an organic dialogue group. People come together and share their stories, and they reach out to people who are newly bereaved to invite them. And my impression is that they're much more successful in reaching out to Palestinians than they are to Jews, though there are a significant number of Jewish members. And this group, just to sort of shorten, they also have formal dialogue programs where they bring together, let's say, 30 people, 15 Palestinians, 15 Israeli Jews, folks who are in the same occupation. And the reason I keep saying Israeli Jews is 20% of the population of Israel in the Green Line is Palestinian, right? So there's a difference in perspective on these issues. Okay. In a world of violence and bereavement, both of these groups reach out within their own communities and across communities, right? They are models of transformative dialogue, but they are limited in their influence. So one of the things I noticed in preparing in interviews and in watching some of the documentaries is there's a huge gap. When we say dialogue is transformative, that means a person has been changed. And once they've been changed, they are very different than their neighbors. And it becomes hard to share. It's not just like sharing a few words, it's sharing a conversion experience. And this is actually echoes some, I think, a comment of Dr. Rams, but one of the Palestinian leaders of the combatants says, God does not change what is in a person's heart until he changes himself. And one of the documentaries I watched it's a tireless story about two men in their own communities, right? One, his 7-year-old daughter was murdered by an Israeli soldier when she was walking to school, shot in the head by a bullet. Another is an Israeli Jewish man whose 14-year-old daughter was killed in a suicide bombing while she was shopping. And these two men are intensely close. They are family by choice. And the hardest work they're doing now is not the transformative, they've been transformed. It's the challenge of reaching out to their peers, sometimes even to their families. So that's the first. How do you bridge that gap? Once you've been transformed by dialogue in terms of transforming others. Two, the segregation continues. So that is what is a barrier to even to the first level of people getting to know each other and treat each other with respect. Three, what I adverted to in the beginning, very few religious leaders are part of these efforts. Why is that? That's not excusable. And there are exceptions. Look, one of the prominent rabbis, Arik Ashram, has devoted his life. He's put his body on the line in confrontations with settlers and soldiers, and he's been physically beaten often in that effort. He's not the only, he's the most prominent. The Focolare movement has over the years facilitated dialogue, and in particular youth dialogue. But these are exceptions, right? For the most part, religious leadership has not met its responsibility in this region. And then the last question I want to raise for the future, which is a question I don't have an answer for, it's the justice question, right? Too often dialogue is about the oppressor educating the oppressed. It happens as a white person, I'm familiar with what happens in the United States, where we live in a systemically racist society. And I don't have the answer to this one at all. I mean, it is mutual learning about the humanity of the other that is transformative. But when Israelis are the oppressor, there is something unjust about putting burdens on the oppressed to educate the oppressors. I think this has got to be a dimension we consider when we think about dialogue. Again, I don't have the answer. So let me just say that despite these challenges, mindful of what Dr. Ram taught us of Mahatma Gandhi's teaching, that if one person progresses, society progresses, I would just say that Combatants for Peace and Parents Circle are my sparks of hope in Palestine, Israel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Pearce. Thank you, because you underline the potential, the transformative potential of dialogue, on which we should work more, but also the difficulties sometimes to share experiences of dialogue and to promote dialogue in context of violence, tensions, and conflicts. Also the difficulty sometimes to work together to reach common goals and to work together for a more peaceful world, a more peaceful international arena, we could say. I give the floor now to our third speaker, Valentina Pantano.
Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon, Valentina. Valentina, you are working on a project. Okay, Valentina, you are working on a project concerning dialogue between a Muslim community and the Focolare movement in Algeria. So, would you like to tell us something more on this project, on this research, and on the first results that you have on this research and also life experience?
Yes, thank you, Chiara. And first, I want to thank all organizations for inviting me to this event. Today, I would like to share this topic that I'm studying in my PhD research. And I want to present a phenomenon of contact between two cultural and religious identities, generally interpreted as rivals and historical in conflict. From one side, the West and Christianity, and to the other side, the East and Islam, whose outcome does not seem to have an historical or typological precedence both in Islamic and Christian lands. I'm referring to the Algerian community of Focolare movement, consisting of a little group of Western Catholics of the Focolare movement and Algerian Muslim in majority, who chose to adhere to the Christian principles of the Chiara Lubic spirituality of communion, continuing to live in their religious, Islamic religiosity. This intercultural and religious phenomenon is the subject of my PhD research that is in progress. So therefore, all the results that will be exposed are still in full development. This project aims to document and analyze on the historical and anthropological level the social and religious behaviors of this community, and to detect the cultural effect and that favor the continuity of the experience and the fortune in the Algerian territory, and what is emerging as the Focolare Muslim expression of the Focolare movement. When it has been documented and analyzed, I intend to put this study in a reflection of a wider historical and anthropological perspective, relating it to some trends of the debate around the theme of universal brotherhood and interreligious dialogue. The history of the Focolare in Algeria begins in 1966, in a crucial stage in the country, in the full context of the process of Arabization and Algerization, started after the independence of the country for the French colonialists in 1962. The experience of the community arose mainly around the Focolare Rotonda, officially named Association Dar es Salaam from 1977, and also to that one of Algiers, has a singular history as it develops fully from the years of the Black Decade, from 1993-1999, when a wave of terrorist actions struck the Algerian population and the infidels, the foreigners and the Catholics of the place. However, the brutal violence does not affect Dar es Salaam, which instead is consolidated thanks to the support of the ecclesiastical power and thanks to the type of spirituality of the Opera di Maria, based on common ideals, a single shared belief, monotheism, social life of mutual aid, and full freedom of religious practice. The written sources consulted up now dated from 1966 to 1986, and oral ones allow us to rebuild the development scenario of the Algerian Focolare community. Immediately, it emerged as an exception both in its genesis and its morphology in relation to the models of Western European Focolare community, majority Christian groups. A report of December 1977 quotes, "The Focolare came 10 years ago without having been requested by the local community and want to discover that new world. Therefore, it's not the local church that calls for the support of Christians in Europe or dictate the conduct of the Focolare group. From the beginning, the Focolare showed a well-established identity on the structural and spiritual levels. Ecclesiastic authorities such as Monsignor Lacaste, Monsignor Duval, Monsignor Tessier welcomed the group of Focolarini and encouraged their experience because it's authentic, and stating that their spirituality is suitable for Algeria because it lives without problems and without giving worry like certain other movements. It should be noted that the still young project defined by Lubick and exported by our Focolarini faithfully is in perfect line with the program of that group of priests defined as progressive, that in the aftermath of independence found this Association d'Etudes 1963 aimed at starting the process of the local Catholic Church decolonization. The program of this association was based on 3 points: proclamation of the gospel supported by a period of in-depth knowledge of Islam and Christianity, definition of new language to be communicated through dialogue, and unselfish service to the neighbor. Among the major exponents there are Monsignor Duval, Father Tertier, Father Scott, and Father Berenguer, the same ones that some oral sources define like protectors of the community, that is, the mediators between the state, and the focolare. To play an important role are the events of the great history, and especially the policies of nationalization that since 1970 reduced significantly the number of foreigners and Christians in the country, leaving the church mutilated, and in this context fits the focolare movement that is expected to remain, according to Monsignor Tercero, the only permanent group of Christians. For this reason, and for the type of spirituality that characterizes the focolare, the Church seems to choose the movement as her right hand, strengthening relations also through institutional agreements. On the other hand, the Islamic power, through the Ministry of Religious Affairs, limits the action of the Catholics on the territory by pronouncing forcefully against the act of proselytism and intimating the Church not to encourage the entry of Christians in the homes of Muslims to talk about religion. What has been said shows the face of a church that, albeit with the hands tied, intends to root its presence in the territory and promote new ways of evangelization, anticipating the times. To understand the phenomena of the community of Dar es Salaam, it's important to continue to investigate the future of the Algerian church and the influence that, especially in the colonial era, it has exerted on the Algerian population through the works of welfarism and educational programs. The purpose is to understand to what extent it is responsible for an unconscious preparation of the Algerian soil for the reception of the Opera di Maria spirituality, and to what extent, in turn, the focolare movement, with the introduction of an effective method of evangelization, may have facilitated the process of local Catholic Church renewal. Although in this first part of research, it seems the Catholic world is the only active agent in this affair. It will be necessary involved to another two possible mediators, who are the mystical Islam and the popular faith. Another aspect that has been examined and is being studied concerns the type of focolare movement's apostolate. The source confirmed the absence of a definite mission of the focolare on the territory, at least until 1977. But their tendencies to pay particular attention to care for Muslims think that even within the Catholic institution itself is not always understood. Since 1980, the mission seems to be clear. In a letter from Chiara Lubeck addressed to the Focolarini, she writes, "If in your cities there is a mosque or a synagogue or some other non-Christian place of worship, know that there is your place." This appeal becomes a manifesto for the Focolarini, who from this moment have cleared their direction, their specific purpose, to establish relationships with Muslims. Nevertheless, it is a missionary approach without proselytism. In fact, according to the source, Focolarini and Muslims of the community share the intention to formulate a new language that aims, on the one hand, to preserve and transmit the gospel messages through the pedagogy of Lubeck without distortions, and on the other one, to keep visually distinct the culture and the religion aspect is still under development. Regarding the community in Dar es Salaam, the Algerian and European oral testimonies tell us of a heterogeneous group whose characteristics reflect the complexity of Algerian culture, especially in terms of ethnic interaction and religious affiliation. What emerges, especially from Algerian sources, is the need to define their own cultural identity, far from the uniforming model imposed by power, and which intends instead to reflect a value system pre-existing at the time of independence, such as freedom, equality and diversity, the family, a concrete spiritual life, a value system that they find in the example of the Focolarinis' life, and that becomes for them an attractive force. In conclusion, consider the general frame of globalization and migratory flows outcomes that cause the issue of the coexistence of people linked to different ideal worlds, And the debates often fall under the cliche of religion are an obstacle of civil coexistence. Conflict is never religious, but always an economic, social, and territorial nature, etc. The experience of the Algerian folklore movement emerged as an element outside of the order. A small group of people from the two opposite sides of the Mediterranean in a few decades managed to build solid relationship of fraternity. The awareness acquired by both of the inefficiency of the mechanism of reducing the other to its own image, and the consequent effort to place one in front of the other with responsibility in order to reach the ultimate goal through the realization of the universal family is one of the main engines of changes process of the cultural level, on the cultural level and social behaviors, visible until now only on a large scale, but that could have greater resonances. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Valentina Pantano, to share with us your first results on this research you're working on, and the complexity of aspects to keep in mind, keep into account when we are talking about dialogue, and especially about Muslim community and Christian or Catholic communities. Cultural aspects, not only religious aspects, historical aspects. Now I would like to share the video that we recorded with Professor Fabio Petito, that we have had the chance to record with Professor Fabio Petito, professor at the University of Sussex in International Relations, on the specific topic of dialogue and religions in the Mediterranean region. So please, Giuseppe, if we can share the video. Fabio Petito is a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Sussex, director of the Freedom of Religion or Belief and Foreign Policy Initiative at Sussex University, and Fabio is also head of the ISPI program on religions and international relations, supported by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation. So Fabio, I give you the floor, starting with a question, which is the role of dialogue and collaboration in Mediterranean politics?
Thank you, Chiara. Thank you to Sophia Global Studies for inviting me. I would have loved to be there in person, but hopefully we'll be able to do that soon. Let me take your question. I think, let's start. In March 2021, Pope Francis made an historic visit to Iraq. The official slogan of the trip was, "You are all brothers." Iraq has been an epicenter of geopolitical instability in the 21st century, and the Pope had in mind this when in 2014, he warned that a third world war fought in piecemeal may have already begun. In the span of a few days, Francis hosted a large interfaith gathering of religious leaders in Ur, the birthplace of the patriarch Abraham, and then in a visit marked by deep symbolism, he met with the Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani in the holy city of Najaf, speaking with him about fraternity and citizenship and the future of religious diversity in Iraq. The trip continued the journey that Francis started with the document of human fraternity co-signed in 2019 with the Grand Imam Sheikh Al-Tayeb. In that document, the two religious leaders sent a powerful message in favor of political inclusion and against the discrimination of minorities, especially in countries where Islam or Christianity represent the majority religion. The message was, if we are all brothers, then we all need recognition and respect, including the right to participate in public life as citizens with full rights, freedoms, and responsibilities. Now, are these events and initiatives politically, or even I would say geopolitically, relevant for the Mediterranean regions. Of course, a region in which polarization and discrimination, also linked to religion, have been on the rise in the last decades, leaving it arguably more unstable, polarized, and fragmented than it was 20 years ago. Well, too often, religion seems to have been on the side of extremism and nationalism, and at the center of a global scenario of conflict and insecurity, often shaped by the West Europe versus Islam narrative of the civilizational clash, or even the Christian-Muslim divides of the religious war. And unfortunately, as UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has recently noted, the current global pandemics seems unfortunately to have amplified this crisis, for it has unleashed what he said was a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, scapegoating, and scaremongering. Well, with this background in mind, in a recent volume that I co-edited with colleagues Fadi Dow and Michael Drissen, entitled Human Fraternity and Inclusive Citizenship, Interreligious Engagement in the Mediterranean, we try to reflect on the political implications and foreign policy implication of this new moment of interreligious initiatives. This volume was a collaboration in itself between Adian, an interreligious dialogue foundation based in Lebanon, ISPI, and with the support of the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs. And I have to say, we were so honored and humbled that included also a beautiful preface forward with the endorsement by the Holy Father Pope Francis, signed by Cardinal Ayusio, the President of the Pontifical Council of Interreligious Dialogue. In this volume, we develop an argument for what we call the need for new interreligious engagement strategies. And I want to spend the last few minutes I have to give you a little bit of taste and a sense of what we mean by that. In fact, the strategy of interreligious engagement is our way to articulate the need of bringing much more to the foreign policy arena and take it seriously, these new dynamics that I was referring to at the beginning of my speech. There are two initial assumptions from which to start. First is that today, policymakers, foreign policymakers around the world have finally increasingly recognized that religion can be part of the solution and actually a strategic resource for diplomacy, peace building, the strengthening of human rights, and advancing of sustainable development. Religious engagement, this is the technical language growingly used among the foreign policy community. Religious engagement is emerging as one of the most promising fields of strategic and creative thinking and practice on which governments and international organizations are working collaboratively with religious actors to achieve common goals, and I would add, hopefully, in the perspective of the common good. So the first assumption is there is this new development in the foreign policy community, which is new. The second assumption is that we are living in an unprecedented era of interreligious initiatives. Interreligious initiatives have been scattered, I would use the language, as seeds of hope for unity. And in some way, they are opening a new era of interreligious dynamic and hope for unity that, unfortunately, the main actors of international politics, from government to international organizations and NGOs, inspired by the 20th century universalist secular ideology, like also the one of human rights, seem really not capable of reproducing. Or at least they don't seem to be able to mobilize as they used to. So this is the second factor, this new novel era of interreligious dynamics. Now, interreligious engagement strategy or interreligious engagement as a new policy framework is the way to bring these two developments together. In fact, we argue that foreign policymakers need to take seriously and engage with these new dynamics of interreligious dialogue and collaboration. through what we call an interreligious engagement policy framework that recognizes them and tries to amplify the effects and the impact of these novel dynamics. Interreligious engagement refers to, therefore, policy-oriented interaction between states and international organizations on the one hand, and religious and interreligious actors, groups, coalitions, platforms, and activities on the other. This interaction can include a wide range of interreligious activity, dialogue and collaboration initiated by multiple actors, from high-level theological exchange to much more informal grassroots social action and interreligious collaboration. We need to think better how to make this connection work. This is the way foreign policymakers and religious actors can amplify the growth of the seeds of hope for the Mediterranean unity scattered by this new era of interreligious dynamics. In this way, new innovative government-religious partnership can actually realistically contribute to a more inclusive and peaceful Mediterranean world. In fact, our volume, which I encourage you to have a look at, it's open access and can be freely consulted through the website of ISPI, argue for the need of a new and reinvigorated approach to interreligious dialogue and collaboration, strategically facilitated and supported by carefully designed post-secular partnership with governments and international organizations. These interreligious engagement strategies at multiple levels can potentially be more impactful, we argue, in building peaceful and inclusive society than a policy of only advocacy or a policy of secular developmental interventions. This vision of a new era of interreligious engagement carried the promise, we hope, for a new realistic politics of hope for the Mediterranean and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you for your contribution. And thank you to underline the need of an interreligious engagement strategy to achieve common goal and to see to the Mediterranean with a politics that try to achieve unity and human fraternity. Thank you. Okay. Just to have the contribution also by Professor Fabio Petito. Now we don't have so much time because our roundtable should end at 4 p.m. But I would like to collect at least one question from the audience, from participants. Our speakers have touched really different aspects of dialogue and of what interreligious dialogue means. So if there are questions, please raise your hand or use the question and answer function, and I will give you the floor. In the meanwhile, maybe I can ask you just to say a key words. Okay, so one word, in your opinion, on which we should work more to promote dialogue in the future, to deepen with our studies, but also to live with our life experience. So a key words that you could choose for the future of interreligious dialogue and the international arena. I will start with Professor Vinu Aram, then Russ Pearce and Valentina Pantano.
That's a tough one. That's a tough one, Chiara. Building trust will be one. For me, that's a prerequisite for any dialogue. Can I also share this word that was coined by Mahatma Gandhi, Sarva Udaya, He brought two words together. Sarvam is all, and Udayam is the progress or the awakening. And I feel the interconnection between individual progress, but also collective transformation.
Thank you, Vinu. Thank you. Russ Pearce.
I was really struck by the comments of my fellow panelists. I already expressed my appreciation for Dr. Ram's comments. I also wanted to say I think this story of the Algerian Focolare dialogue, I think it's wonderful that it's getting a lot more coverage. I have had some familiarity with it, but it's really, really important. I believe Fabio Petito's point, I was unaware until now about this effort, and so that's what I would say is that I think there's a lot of room for the Catholic Church and for the Focolare movement to take leadership in the Mediterranean. I mean, part of it is that, let's say with Israel-Palestine, the Focolare, one of the few communities with very close relationships, both with Muslims and with Jews. And of course, Catholics in that area are Palestinian. And so there is this potential, I think, to bring people together. And I just want to note that the last thing I was going to also say. So when I credited the Focolare movement for being one of the sort of few religious forces for dialogue in Palestine, Israel, I should have noted that, those first dialogues were envisioned and promoted by Margaret Karam when she was in Jerusalem. So I want to, of course, thank her and give her credit for moving that forward.
Thank you, Russ. And Valentina Pantano, one word or one key concept?
Yes, maybe I have two words. One is the consequence of the other. The first one is the other. I would like that we should rewrite again the meaning of the other, as we used to think. So when we meet each other, we should think that when I move to the other side, I'm the other. So this is the first. The second, maybe, is a consequence, is enculturation. So that means that we have to meet the other and with this empty soul. So it means that we have to we have to meet other and want to know more of their culture. So maybe this is what I think.
Sure.
Chiara, can you take 10 seconds more?
Yeah, sure.
I was very struck by Valentina's mentioning of new ways of dialogue. Valentina, there was a wonderful meeting that was hosted by Religions for Peace and the World Council of Churches. And one of the joint presentations that I made with Professor Anant Rambachan was in ways of dialoguing. What we do now in the West, sitting around the table, is a very particular way of interreligious dialogue. And so we have to tap into new ways of interreligious, because the ultimate aim, Chiara, is to understand each other better, to be able to share problems, to be able to transform oneself for the better in that. So Valentina, I want to thank you for that, especially because, when Professor Petito was speaking about engagement with government, he also spoke about complexities, Chiara. And, the way the Abrahamic faiths are organized, Christianity, Islam, is very different from the faith traditions of the subcontinent. We don't have a pope. We don't have a single authority. So unless we are open to new ways of that, women across all religions, patriarchy in its blatant form excludes women. So that's one thing. The second thing, Chiara, 10 more seconds, is I can't reiterate what Professor Pearce has told us, tapping into the love. That's the practical thing, I think. I think once you challenge yourself to love the other, and Valentina has qualified the other, then I think a lot of these constructed forms of being able to hate because you externalize the person is challenged. So I think tapping into internal capacities to love is something that Chiara has spoken about, but I think is the reason why young people are sowing seeds of hope. Professor Petito spoke about seeds of hope, and young people are doing it in every major global challenge: environment, public health, learning crisis. So that seeds of hope, I think, is linked because of their increased ability to tap into internal love. And as adults, we kind of start losing that a little bit because we're caught in the ways of the world.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Vinu. And thank you to each one of you, really, for this precious roundtable, for your contributions. And for sure, we stay in contact. We continue to deepen the issue of dialogue, interreligious dialogue, and also the practical aspects of dialogue in our life. I close the roundtable, and I remind you that we will continue our discussion tomorrow with the third day of our seminar. We will meet at 9:30 to explore the issue of dialogue related to politics tomorrow. So thank you again, and we keep in contact.
Thank you, Chiara. Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Professor Pearce.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank you all.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Madeline.
Thanks.